Good evening, everybody. I am Gwen Chapman. I'm the Dean of the College of Social and Applied Human Sciences here at the University of Guelph, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here this evening for our panel discussion, Connecting to Conservation in Canada. As we prepare to do some listening and thinking and reflecting about our relationship to the land and our responsibilities to the land, it's important that we acknowledge that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people, and more recently, the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We offer our respect to our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships with them. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to the land where we work and learn. At the University of Guelph, part of our territorial acknowledgement also recognizes the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which is a peace treaty that was made between Indigenous nations before European arrival. The symbolism and imagery of this covenant, I think, are particularly relevant for tonight. If you picture a large wooden dish full of beaver stew with one spoon that is meant to feed all of us, this image characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We take what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. We also acknowledge that this gathering place is currently home to many of the many visitors and people from many different lands. Connecting to Conservation in Canada is presented by the College of Social and Applied Human Sciences and the Department of Geography specifically in support of the Kinross Chair in Environmental Governance. The University and Kinross Gold Corporation joined together in 2008 in a new education and research network to promote natural resource management and responsible natural resource management. We recognize that governance is more than just a government responsibility and action, but it indicates the full range of accountability and actions taken by Indigenous groups, businesses, communities, not-for-profit organizations, and citizens. The Kinross Chair in Environmental Governance is a unique chair in that it brings a high-profile expert from the community to the university for a residence period of 4 to 6 months. And through the Kinross Chair, we're able to have somebody in residence once every 3 years. We recognize that in the in-between times, it was important to have some kind of event to maintain the momentum and to continue that networking between community, university, around resource issues. And so this is our first of this kind of panel, but the idea of the Conservation in Canada panel was born from that. And so we hope that this panel will inspire productive and thought around environmental governance, and we're very pleased to have the panelists here tonight. I want to thank the Department of Geography, particularly Chair John Smithers, and faculty members who've made this happen. As well as other members from the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute and the college. And I will now call on our president, Dr. Franco Vaccarino, to come to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Gwen, for that introduction and for teeing up this terrific event. I have to, first of all, welcome. Welcome. It's great to see our University of Guelph community here. We have students, faculty, staff here, but also our broader community. So nice to have everyone here. And as I was entering this building, one of the great things about my job is just to see how our places where we do our work transform and come to life in different ways. In this particular place, the Arboretum, it's actually the first time I've seen it in this particular configuration. I got to tell you, it's absolutely fantastic, and in this with our surroundings here. So again, thank you and welcome everyone here to the Arboretum at the University of Guelph. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. You know, these kinds of discussions are exactly what universities should be about. Providing a platform for thoughtful and careful reflection on key issues of the day. And I'd like to thank, on that note, Kinross Gold for their important support in the Kinross, for the Kinross Chair in Environmental Governance. And Gwen mentioned that in her remarks, and this kind of support is absolutely key for us as we move forward on key issues of the day. And in that regard, I'd like to welcome Dominic Chandler, who's with us, who's Kinross's Vice President of Community Relations, who is with us. And thank you again, Dominic and Kinross, for your support. Thank you. Let me also take this opportunity to begin by acknowledging and thanking our panelists for being here today. And I have to tell you, we have an absolutely terrific, first-rate panel members here who are also renowned speakers in their own right. Let me mention each of them. David Miller, who's former CEO of World Wildlife Fund, and I will say very recently a former, because he now represents, as of I think only maybe a week or a few days ago? This morning, even. So we are right on the bubble here. And now he now represents C40 cities and is the regional director for North America, and an incredibly important organization that actually thinks about sustainability. Sustainability is a centrality of cities in our world today, and his job will be to oversee the North American division of that global network and organization. So welcome, and also a great friend, former mayor of the city of Toronto, and bringing back some wonderful memories from past years when we worked together in Toronto. I'd like to also take this opportunity to welcome Elizabeth May, absolutely fearless leader and wonderful leader of the Green Party of Canada. Great to have you here. And I'll mention also, and I'll note that we have also with us here the leader of the Green Party of Ontario and also a Guelph community member, Mike Schreiner, who's with us in the audience. So great to have the Green Party represented.
Thank you.
Great. We also have with us today Faisal Mula, incoming faculty member in the Geography Department and from the David Suzuki Foundation. Welcome, Faisal. And also absolutely thrilled to have with us John Cutfeet from the KI First Nations, and just terrific to have you sharing in this panel to get that important perspective for us. Thank you very much. Yes. And we also have with us, of course, Judy Madron, tonight's moderator, and for many of us, a familiar voice, a former host of CBC Radio's World Report, also importantly, a University of Guelph graduate, and this past year's, yes, absolutely, this past year's Alumna of Honor recipient. Welcome, Judy. Now, conservation and the environment, of course, are part of the university's DNA in many ways, and this theme of conservation and the environment show up in so many programs across campus in both the natural as well as the social sciences. And this really is a big part of our identity as a comprehensive university, these themes. And why? Because these issues are embedded in so many elements and aspects of our lives, and it's for that reason that you see increasingly conservation and environmental issues coming up across the spectrum at our universities, right from our biological, natural sciences, as well as the social sciences. Scholars have long been drawn, actually, to the University of Guelph. I would say it's part of our brand, our identity, as a place to learn and begin the journey as conservation researchers and professionals that are committed to sustaining and expanding knowledge to quite simply improve life. And by the way, if you look at our tagline on the website, and I love it for its simplicity and I think profundity, and that is that we strive to very simply improve life. And I think that this panel today captures that theme, both in communities locally and throughout the world. Students, of course, are central to this and are the source of so much of the energy and inspiration. I will tell you that our focus in this area has been very, very influenced by our students and the energy that they've brought to this issue and helped raise our own awareness in a broader sense at the university of the importance of conservation leadership in both science and citizenship. Now, as we know, this year marks Canada's 150th celebration. It's a good time to I think, in that context, to pause and reflect on what Canada looks like today. Nothing stays the same, and if we look at the last 150 years, we've seen the evolution and development of Canada, and to talk about how to ensure that the next 150 years on this land include the rich ecosystems, the fresh air, the clean water, the unique and important flora, fauna, animals, and creatures that amaze and that inspire, as well as nutritious foods that we're so fortunate to have. And I mention those because that's such a big part of our identity as a country. And as much as we've changed in these 150 years, I think those elements of who we are have been preserved as a kind of common denominator through all that change. We can do this only with respect to, for those attributes and a concerted effort to ensure their continued existence, their sustainability. So a special thank you on that note to the Department of Geography, really, for taking a leadership role in this event and focusing our attention on the environment and conservation. So on that note, I'd like to now introduce Judy Madron, tonight's moderator. And many of you, of course, will be familiar with Judy's background, but let me say a few words about her. For many years, Judy started the day with millions of Canadians across the country sharing the latest news of the world and our nation as host of CBC Radio's World Report. Her day began, I kind of cringe at this thought, her day began at 4:15 in the morning at her computer and continued with 7 live broadcasts across Canada. She was also the CBC's broadcast advisor, providing language and pronunciation recommendations to CBC broadcasters and writers on radio, television, as well as on cbc.ca. Now, in 1990, Judy produced, this is a bit of background that's interesting, Judy produced the first public reading of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol with CBC readers, and then expanded the readings across Canada. They were and are held in dozens of communities across the country each year and raise money to benefit local charities of all kinds. The Governor General awarded Judy the Meritorious Service Medal in November for her efforts with the Christmas Carol readings. And this past June, the University of Guelph also presented Judy with the Alumni of Honor Award. So congratulations on those terrific accomplishments. Now, since leaving CBC, she's focused full-time on sound portraits, which are recorded interviews, autobiographies of people, young and old. She and her husband, Tim Elliott, have now made their home in Stratford, just down the street. I'm actually spending my Thanksgiving Monday in Stratford, so I'll be there. And they're delighted with the community and life in southwestern Ontario. Please join me in welcoming the panel members and Judy. Well done.
So I started life here at the University of Guelph to study home economics. I am one of the MAC girls. I don't know if you ever heard about MAC girls. And when a senior guy put my name tag around my neck, he said, "You're here for your MRS." I said, "No, my BHSC." And then I got it. It wasn't funny then, and it's not funny now. But home economics is the study of using everything efficiently and effectively with no waste. So I think it's a good connection here. This is assuredly going to be interesting, important, and enlightening. I'm very proud of the University of Guelph for its initiative, for throwing light on feeding and taking care of our world, promoting responsible natural resource management. And as a place to call home, Canada is more than fortunate. But we're all in danger of, or we're already there, we take it for granted. You know that old saying, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. So we are going to have a gathering that's going to help us figure out a little bit more of that. For intelligent, experienced, environmentally passionate people gathered to share what they know. We have now less than 2 hours, so I have a plan. Each of the panelists is going to introduce themselves. We'll explore conservation in Canada, and there will be some time for you, the audience, to ask questions. There should have been on your seat a card, and that card is to be used for you to write a question out. Please put your name on it. And if you have a question you'd like to ask one of the panelists, write the question, pass it along to the end of the row, and people will be keeping an eye out for the cards. And at the end, when we have some time, we'll answer as many as possible. So we have John Cutfee, Elizabeth May, David Miller, and Dr. Faisal Mula. And we're going to start with 2 questions for each of you. Very brief, of course. You will be brief. Yes. The first question is to think about your own life and tell a seminal story that might illuminate your interest in conservation and preserving our world. That's the first thing. And the second, would you please speak for a couple of minutes about what has been your particular passion and focus in this? So the first question, a little story about your life, and then what your passion is. Can we start with you?
Sure.
Dr.
Sure.
Mula?
So like many people that live in Canada, my family came to Canada as immigrants. We came in 1969 as political dissidents from South Africa. My parents were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. And I remember when I was a very young age, as my friends at the end of the school year would go off to summer camp or to the cottage or to some backcountry camping trip, I would ask my parents, are we going to go out into nature? And my mom responded, she said, Faisal, brown people like us, we don't camp, we picnic. And the reality is that it was sort of my first experience with nature. It wasn't something grand. I didn't see a grizzly bear until about 5 years ago. I hadn't been to some of the iconic places that a lot of Canadians, I've still never been to Algonquin National Park, but I did live on the edge of the city of Toronto, a place called the Rouge Watershed, and I spent a lot of time rambling across fields, farms, and forests. And that's really where I sort of fell in love with nature, and it has led to me becoming a scientist and then working for some 16 years with David Suzuki, and now joining Guelph as a new faculty member.
David?
So first of all, I want to acknowledge and thank Guelph for the invitation. The Arboretum is absolutely beautiful, as is the campus. I've only had the privilege of coming to this institution a couple of times, and 2 times ago it was to play your rugby team on behalf of the University of Toronto in 1983. So that was a little bit ago. We won the Ontario Championship. But Guelph's team was very good. So that sounded awfully condescending, didn't it? It's extraordinarily beautiful. It's a wonderful campus, and it does combine, I think, physically the values that President Vaccarino spoke about. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to Kinross for sponsoring. Like many people in this room, I'm an immigrant to Canada. Mm-hmm. We came to Canada from England in 1967, not really because of any political issues, but because my mom thought that I would have a much better chance in life in Canada than England. We lived in a tiny little farming village where by modern standards, we lived quite environmental lives, but that was because nobody had any money. So we all gardened. We had our garden, the farms. There was a beet farm, a dairy, and an egg farm. They were all what you would now call organic. They just didn't use pesticides, because why bother spending the money on pesticides and other treatments? And we all had compost heaps. So that was sort of what I was used to. Got to Canada and didn't feel very much at home. There was no soccer. There was no cricket. There was no rugby at that point in time. And I felt sort of out of place. And I didn't feel at home in this country until I went on a canoe trip in Algonquin Park on Thanksgiving weekend 45 years ago. And in fact, I'm going back this weekend with my wife Jill and a couple of friends. And that trip was transformative for me for a whole bunch of reasons. Even in English farming villages, you don't have these huge strands of beautiful forests that were multicolored. And we went in on a day somewhat like today. It was just stunningly beautiful and it was gorgeous. And you could drink the water right out of the lake. You didn't even have to purify it in 1977. It was stunning. And then we got up the next day and it snowed. There were 4 14-year-old boys and 2 teachers. And I don't know if those of you know 14-year-old boys very well, but 14-year-old boys are often not very smart, and none of us had brought rain gear. So we spent the next 3.5 days canoeing in the snow and the rain without any protection. It became this unbelievable endurance test. But for me, it forged a link with Canada. I felt Canadian. I survived the endurance test. The beauty and the majesty and, perhaps a bit the terror of the outdoors, and the fact you could just dip your cup in the lakes and drink the water was extraordinary for me. And since then, I've been an environmentalist. In all of my career as a lawyer, I had clients who were working on serious environmental issues. I've had a gift of a career as an elected official and able to help move cities' agenda forward and at the World Wildlife Fund. And it really, for me, comes back to that formative experience 45 years ago tomorrow.
Elizabeth?
Well, this is where I have to admit I'm abnormal. I was born in 1954, and it didn't take a big wilderness experience for me to feel connected to nature. I don't know why. I was born the way I was, but when I was 2, because my mother reported this to me, because I don't remember it myself, I looked up at the sky, and there was an airplane above, and I told my mom, I don't like airplanes. And she said, but why not? I'd never been in one. And now I have a lot of reasons not to like airplanes. But then, but I was an infant person, and I don't know why I said, because they scratch the sky. So my mom always expected me to, she just thought, there wasn't a term environmentalist when I was 2. When I was, we lived on 7 acres that I knew intimately. We didn't move around, we didn't go to camps, I just knew my 7 acres really, really well. And we had a hobby farm, and one year a whole bunch of our lambs died, and it wasn't till 2 years later, when I was 11 or 12, I read Silent Spring and recognized the symptoms that my lambs went through as they died in nervous contractions and convulsions. And I wrote to the town and asked, were you spraying by any chance any pesticides 2 summers ago? And they were spraying malathion and methoxychlor. So I wrote back and said, that killed our lambs. So I became, but there was not a moment that I became attached to nature. I really have always felt extremely at one with the natural world. And I'm very, I guess, fortunate in that, but I became an anti-pesticide activist because pesticides killed my lambs.
John?
Good evening. Knox. Knox, I bring you greetings from I grew up in the fish camps, and I remember going to sleep at night, hearing the wind through the leaves, hearing the water lap along the shore, the rocks by the shoreline. And I knew everything was okay. I was safe, I was comfortable, and that I've always felt a sense of freedom when I hear water lapping against rocks or the wind through the trees and going through the leaves. And I never forgot that. And as we went throughout our day-to-day survival, we were living on the land and the water that provided for us and provided security for us. And those are the things I remember from my childhood. But I also thought there has to be something more. And for most of my life, that question always is, well, what more is there? And as I got older, I began to get involved in discussions on land issues, getting into the political discussions that happened. My uncle came to me one day and said, "Can you come in and help me?" This was on a weekend. And I went into his office, and he was pacing back and forth, and he was upset about something. And I said to him, "Dennis, what's the matter?" And he says, "I just came from a negotiations meeting with the Ontario negotiator for the memorandum of understanding we had with the Bob Rae government at that time." And he says, and the negotiator says, "We have no lands and resources." And I said, "That cannot be. That's not true. It can't be true." Because I always believed growing up that there was something more that the land had to offer, that everything else had to offer to us as a people too. So most of my life has been saying that, dealing with that position that we have no lands and resources. And most of the work that I've done has been to say, yes, we do. And in KI, we had to fight off an exploration, at least 2 exploration companies trying to come into the territory, doing whatever they wanted without thinking about what we wanted. So that's my passion in life, is to be able to say to people, yes, we matter. We may be brown, but we do matter. And we have a right to exist. And that's been my passion as I got older. And to kind of counteract that position that this Ontario negotiator had, that we had no lands and resources. So my passion now is to try and deal with the current legislative regime that basically relegates us to having no land and resources, because, as you know, most of you know, 0.2% is what reserve land base is right across the country. And also that 99.8% is vested in the provincial and federal crowns, basically leaving us with nothing. But I like to say that we can change that. And that's, going forward, what I focus on is that we do have land and resources, only the legislative regime has basically tried to take that away, and but we're still here. That's my best.
John, place KI for us. Where is it?
That's where I'm from, or KI for short. It's located about 600 kilometers northwest of Thunder Bay. It's when you go up towards Hudson's Bay, Suluk. I don't know how many people know where Suluk, Ontario is, but it's halfway up to Fort Severn towards Hudson's Bay. That's where Ninwug is.
So I'm interested, conservation in one sense means keeping something the same. But what is your view of what conservation is, or what is an environmentalist? You know, we throw these terms around. Anybody?
Sure. Several years ago, there was a seminal paper that was published in an academic journal called Science. And what the scientists found is that there's very few places on the Earth that is no longer being touched by modern humans. The fact is, from Arctic tundra to primeval rainforest, we've changed this world irrevocably in a very short period of time. You just need to look around here in the greater Toronto and Hamilton area, ecosystems that have been fragmented by growing towns and cities, crisscrossed by roads and transmission lines and pipelines, and further to the west, pockmarked by flare stacks, and other infrastructure that's used to frack and strip mine and drill fossil fuels from the ground. The problem for me as an ecologist is that the conversion of natural areas is not just harming the homes and habitat of wildlife, that Canadians care very deeply about caribou or grizzly bears or orca whales, they are literally eviscerating the very life support systems of our planet, the ability to produce clean air, clean water, healthy food to eat. Scientists, we call these things ecosystem services. These are the benefits that we get from nature. And so for me, conservation is about recognizing our own dependency on the land for our own survival, as well as the survival of all the non-human life that this place is blessed with.
Okay, so how's Canada doing? Does it have a plan?
Well, that's an interesting segue from what is conservation.
Yeah.
So, can I answer both?
Yes.
Because I was going to say in answer to your first question, what is conservation, what's an environmentalist? I was going to say I don't really know, because it means all sorts of things. Yeah. So there's 2 or 3 thoughts I had, and it does flow into your next question. Under the word conservative starts with conserve, which conservation also starts with. And under many conservative governments across Canada, we've had great conservation results. Under the last one, we didn't. In fact, quite the opposite. And it's been a very odd thing for me to watch in my lifetime in this country since 1967, how these issues have become politicized. And I think, so when I think about what is conservation, what is the environment, what's a conservationist, what's an environmentalist, I start with the proposition that it's a Canadian. Canadians deeply value our natural heritage. There's absolutely no question about this. Mike, can I tell the story of your focus group, or is that allowed? Or is that private?
Go ahead.
It's not private anymore, is it? So the Green Party invited some people in this community to a focus group, and it's important. I actually only know one of the answers, so I can't say all the rest of them. But and they're all people who had not made up their mind about how they sit in the next election. And one of the questions was, is climate change real? And everybody in the focus group burst out laughing. And they said, what are you talking about? Of course it's real. It's a ridiculous question. And to me, that was a very Canadian response. Canadians, they may have different ways of coming about it, but I think we have a shared value in this country from all sorts of backgrounds of supporting our natural heritage, natural values. And if I'm right in that, you segue to, do we have a plan? Well, I think the answer is no. The World Wildlife Fund Canada, which I'm about not to be president of, just brought out a really important study. I don't know if people saw it a week or two ago, the Living Planet Report Canada. I do see some nods. Half of the vertebrate species in Canada studied, which are the ones we have data on, there were 903 studied, half of them are in decline, and species that are in decline are declining on average 83% populations. Like, that is stunning. And the only way, from my perspective, to address that is to really build on the values of Canadians who are conservationists and environmentalists, and bring in industry, bring in government, work with organizations like David Suzuki Foundation, WWF, and work with Indigenous peoples. It has to be a huge collective effort. But the situation is really, really serious and requires some urgency. And we know what the problem is. It's us. We're creating the problem, whether it's pollution, climate change, habitat loss, some other things. Your academics should know better the details than me. We're creating the problems. So we need to build the solutions. And my optimism comes from the fact that Canadians want to do it, but we really need to show some urgency.
We're also an island, in a sense. What can Canada do that's going to make a change?
Well, we can send a former mayor down to the U.S. to organize mayors there to fight Donald Trump.
We can do a lot.
We can do a lot.
Yeah, and I would just say that when you ask, and Judy, maybe we've passed the point of talking about what conservation means, but I don't know if I'm being too academic about it, but for me, the word conservation is a very anthropocentric concept and really comes out of the late 19th century. And writers, Gifford Pinchot and that sort of doctrine of conservation was one of you conserve enough that you have sustainable yield that you go back and take more later. Concepts of conservation, if you go back to Humboldt, well, that's exciting and mind-blowing, and Humboldt influenced Thoreau, and Thoreau influenced John Muir. So if you get to that strain of thinking, it gets deeply spiritual. John Muir, by the way, was the raving, religious, wonderful conservationist who founded Sierra Club in 1892. But Muir said, when you get hold of anything in the universe, you find it's hitched onto everything else. So an understanding of the integral connectivity of humanity as part of this invention of nature, or whatever you want to call it, is a deeply spiritual thing, which when you really want to figure out outside the academics who knew this all along, it's indigenous peoples everywhere. So when I look at where we are in Canada right now, we have national parks, yes, but we're failing to maintain them. We have protected areas, but they are islands in areas of disturbance that are shrinking. We have the threats that David mentions. Of course, climate change is the all-encompassing challenge, and one that if we don't fix, nothing else matters. So I agree, an environmentalist, a conservationist, whatever, is a Canadian. And as soon as you get involved and a community decides we're going to save this piece of forest, we're going to go out there and we're going to rescue our wild salmon. As soon as they do that, the media says, oh, those are activists. Those are conservationists. But yesterday they were Canadians.
Any thoughts, John?
Yes. To me, conservation, when I hear the word conservation, our people have been practicing conservation practices for many years before conservation became a buzzword of society. When our people were living on the land, they moved from one place to another so as not to deplete the resources that were there, and they would kind of go around in a cycle and get back to that area again in the future, because they have conserved the resources that were in that one particular area. So our people have been practicing conservation long before conservation became really popular. And so as I think about that, our people have always wanted to be a part of protecting the lands. And that's what we do, is maintaining, trying to protect what we have in KI. There was an intrusion from an outside force at one point that ended up wanting to impact a really ecologically sensitive area by doing some exploration in the territory without talking to the community, and even without thinking about what the consequences potentially might be. Because from where they wanted to do the drilling, they would have had to do acid mine drainage, which led into a river system that fed into our lake, our main lake. And of course, it would have impacted the community downstream. And so, of course, with guidance from our elders, we had to say, no, you cannot do this. And of course, we did it as at the cost of liberty for some of our members who were incarcerated for a certain amount of time. But we were able to make our stand, and were able to get certain pieces of legislation introduced as a result of the actions that we took and the positions that we took. And it goes back to that thinking that I introduced earlier, where my uncle was told that you have no lands and resources. And so we said, the position is then, okay, whoever said that has to prove to us that they have jurisdiction over those lands and resources they claim we do not have. And as a result of that position, a piece of legislation was introduced that we call the Far North Act. It's in the Far North Act of Ontario. And really what it does in the eyes of KI is that it just basically solidifies the position of Ontario that they do have jurisdiction with the consent of the communities that work to develop a community-based land use plan. But when we look at the land use plan that they put in place, it's not really a community-based. It's an MNR Ontario-based type of land use planning. And so we continue on saying, hang on just a sec, we need to take a look at this because we have to protect these lands and conserve some of these lands because under the land use plan, there are certain things that cannot happen on those protected areas, designated protected areas that they have. So what does that leave for us? Because at the end of the day, under that process, the minister decides whether it's acceptable or not. Anyway, those are some of the challenges that we face. Does Canada have a plan? Well, not until Canada is prepared to address the 0.2% land-based issue as well as the 99.8% to have the involvement of Indigenous people in the planning of protected areas properly.
And Faisal, you have said that Indigenous-led conservation is crucial. What would you say that looks like?
So I think what environmentalists need to understand that is that if there is one thing that we can do, it is to support Indigenous people to get their lands back. And the reason for that is that the rights that Indigenous people hold, be it under treaty, under Indigenous rights, recognized under Section 35 of the Constitution, or international obligations under the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they all talk about the rights of Indigenous peoples to be able to hunt, to fish, to gather berries, to do all the things that they always did before colonization. Those rights are inherently predicated on the ability of the land to be able to produce water and fish and berries and meat. Those rights are effectively meaningless if the land is degraded as a consequence of industrial development. So there's a very well-known and someone I respect immensely, Pam Palmater, who's a professor of Indigenous governance at Ryerson University, and she said the best and last hope for the planet are Indigenous peoples. And I personally believe that very much so in terms of Indigenous peoples being able to exercise their governance. So for the Suzuki Foundation, that's been very, very important for us, is to be able to work in support of Indigenous peoples, not just to protect their lands in terms of exercising their rights, but all of the ecological values that they have stewarded under those rights for millennia.
And so, any ideas on how you do that?
Sure, I think John can give a much better example. In the places where I worked with the Denizah and the Cree people in northeastern British Columbia. And the Denizah people, 67% of their lands have now been developed by industrial development. And within the heart of the largest fracking field on the continent, which is the Montney Shale Play, there is a very small little community called Doig River First Nation that have declared a tribal protected area that is 90,000 hectares in size, completely surrounded by all the fracking and the mining and the resource development. And if you'll just bear with me, I'm going to read a very short sentence. This is from an elder by the name of Chief Jerry Atachi, who just passed away recently from Doig. And this is what his motivation was for declaring Kitsatse, which in the Beaver language means old spruce. And the reason it's called old spruce is that it's a remarkable forest. It's a boreal forest, which scientists like myself say, well, these forests should burn every 40 to 60 years. But for whatever reason, Kitsatse is never burned. It's a sacred place. No fire has ever gone through Kitsatse, and the Doig people believe that that's the reason why they need to protect it. It's the place where they come from. But this is what he said. He says, we would go to Kitsatse to hunt moose, grieve our loved ones, and heal our spirits. We've been here forever, even before they made the Alberta-BC border. We use Kitsatse for healing, spiritual healing. We get healed out there and we pray. It's the last place for our people. And when I talked to Jerry before he died, essentially he said, that's the last place where they can exercise their treaty and Indigenous rights and still hunt and fish and gather plants and do all the things that they've done for thousands of years. Because there's nowhere else in the landscape where you will find those elements of biodiversity. So that's one of the reasons why we've been working for many years with the Doig people to protect Kitsatse as a tribal protected area. But I know, John, you've done the same in your territory as well, right?
Yes, basically what we did was we ended up, under the advice of the elders, we had to protect the whole watershed area, just to make sure we protect the water first. But also we've been developing certain documents that protects the territory. Kitsnimexabaki, we call it. And it's done under the authority of Ganwe Dandake. And that's the law that governs our people to look after the land and protect the land and keep the land. And so Ganwenda and Dake, when the companies came in and wanted to try and do what they can to extract resource from there without any benefit to the community, was invoked by the community, Ganwenda and Dake, because when we try to use the established mechanisms of society, such as the treaty land entitlement claim and also the duty to consult through the Supreme Court of Canada, they were discounted, they were disregarded. So Kshnemexabenenawak said that that's our people, that's who we are. Said, okay, so you're not going to listen to these laws, we'll deal with this one. It's called Ganwe Dandake. And so Ganwe Dandake was never revoked after that dispute. So it still reigns within the territory. And that's the position of Kshnemexabenenawak, is that we use our authority, we use our laws to protect the territory, to ensure that the lands and waters are protected. But keep in mind, when you talk about conservation in different areas, those are people's homelands. People live there. It's not an empty land, such as the concept of terra nullius. Our people have lived throughout the whole territory, used that territory for its benefit and survival. And so when we talk about conserving areas, you're talking about protecting them to make sure nothing happens to them. But what about the people that live there, that use them traditionally in the past? How do we deal with that? And I think those are some of the things that we need to look at if we're going to look at conservation as meaningful conservation in the future.
Yeah.
Judy, I've got an interesting example, much smaller than what John and Faisal were speaking about, but I think it's a practical example, and it's worth mentioning. At WWF, we have an agreement with the Gitga'at First Nation in northern British Columbia to mutually conduct ocean conservation. I don't know if people know the Gitga'at or their territory, but they live in Hartley Bay, and they're heroes because when the BC ferry ran aground a few years ago and sank, the people of Hartley Bay went out and rescued the people from the BC ferry. It's quite an amazing story. The people there essentially live off the ocean. Some are commercial fishers. Otherwise, when I was there, an elder was talking, and he said our traditional saying is, when the tide is out, the table is set, because of all the shellfish. And so we signed an agreement with them in which we both support science in the oceans around their territory, and we're doing things like listening to whales to test the impact of commercial shipping activity on the health of the whales. We're doing it because this is a really important part of the coast of British Columbia, and there was a pipeline that was going to be built here, and there's some other pressures that we think are wrong because it's so special. There's a very special kind of bear, the spirit bear. If people know this, it's a black bear that's mutated white, and it's very spiritual for the Gitga'at. It's an amazing thing, and if the salmon die, it'll be gone from the earth. I think the Gitga'at have never said this to me, but they have certain rights there that they're very secure in, but I think they're doing it because they're like your people. They want to assert jurisdiction over the ocean. And they don't have jurisdiction over the ocean. They have jurisdiction over the land, that's very clear, but not over the ocean. And I think it's a really interesting way for them in supporting basic science and in partnering with an organization like WWF to all of a sudden extend their reach. And I think they would consider this to be part of their traditional territory because it's the ocean in which they make their living and get their food. But it's a small agreement. It's a very live one. And I think an interesting example of how a conservation organization can partner with a First Nation to achieve results that both are interested in.
Did you want to
Well, I have an example, but I didn't know if you wanted to move along. But the British Columbia is a hotbed of conflicts over resources where, if you will, environmentalists are in solidarity with First Nations because First Nations are, for reasons of saying this is our land and our resources, and also this would be a disaster. We'd lose our salmon, we'd lose our waters. This would not be sustainable for us as a people. And so I'm very honored to be working with many, many First Nations. But when I think about an example, it's one from the past. It was an extraordinary example it's from the Haida, the story of stopping the destruction of the southern third of the archipelago of what is called Haida Gwaii, which used to be called the Queen Charlotte Islands, and to stop the logging of that southern third of a body, just an archipelago of islands, of course, south of Alaska, off the BC coastline, with committed timber licenses to McMillan Bloedel. And the closer we got to negotiating, well, the Haida started by blockading the logging roads. This was all in about, it was a 12-year campaign. The blockades on the logging roads, I think, were 1985. People, just as in John's experience, were arrested for protecting their land, for protecting what's been described as Canada's Galapagos, because it was a refugia in the last ice age, so there are species unknown anywhere else on the planet that are found in Haida Gwaii. And in the end, we were able to negotiate. I was in government then. We were able to negotiate to stop the logging. But as we got closer and closer to being able to stop the logging by agreement with the government of British Columbia to create a national park reserve there, the logging companies went into triple shifts. They were making sure they were logging 24 hours a day so they could get as much out of there as possible. I now have the great joy of having a constituent who was at that time the senior BC minister in Mulroney's cabinet. My constituent is Senator Pat Carney, who lives on Saturna Island in my riding. Pat told me the story just recently. She said, you know, Elizabeth, when we were negotiating, we were talking to Bill Vandersam to try to stop the logging up there. And he said to me, you know, Pat, there's trees up there 1,000 years old. They should have been cut long ago. She said, that's what I was dealing with. I just thought you should know. So anyway, to stop the logging, but the other part about this is sovereignty. Because the Council of the Haida Nation didn't just stop with stopping the logging and say, okay, we'll suffer along with the national parks. They said, okay, Parks Canada, you're now negotiating with a sovereign nation, and we want to know how co-management works. I think Guayahanas National Park is a great example of co-management, but it went beyond that. And the Council of the Haida Nations said to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, we want to establish our own fisheries rules and regulations. We want to control gear type. We want to know what the catch rates are. We're going to control that. So the Council of the Haida Nation and DFO have an agreement for co-management in the adjacent seas. On the land of the southern third of the archipelago of Haida Gwaii is the National Park Reserve Guayahanas. And it remains, one of the strongest, there's so many strong First Nations throughout the area I'm privileged to work with, but it was one of the reasons that I thought Enbridge doesn't have a hope in hell if they think they're going to take tankers past Haida Gwaii. Not a hope in hell. And yay, they didn't.
Robin Roth, Professor Robin Roth, introduced me to the concept of the settler society. I had not heard of that or thought about it, and it really took me aback. So we've got settler society and we have indigenous peoples. Now, in my consciousness, the settler society is ruled by economics. So when something costs too much, we stop buying it. And I'm wondering, is that the key forward? Somehow, there's concepts that, it's bad to waste things. It's bad that that there are extinctions. But can we do it with government? Can we do it with working together? Or do we have to use money?
Well, can I try to answer that question?
Sure.
But I'll answer it in a maybe slightly different way.
Okay.
So I think all of you have seen the ads from Scotiabank. The tagline is, "You're richer than you think," right? So the first time that came out, I was incredibly pissed because I wasn't feeling particularly wealthy. I paid off my student loan 2 years ago. I'm now 47 years old. It took me over 25 years to pay off my student loans. And I found it really strange that this company would brand, selling financial services on this idea of wealth. But the reality is that they're absolutely right. This country is loaded. But our true wealth is not just found in our government coffers, in our corporate balance sheets, or our personal pocketbooks. I honestly believe our true wealth is found in the bank of nature, fields, farms, forests, oceans, and other ecosystems. And the reality is that these things also have value. The problem is that under our market economy, we don't treat these things as having any value whatsoever. We imagine that those ecosystem services, clean air, clean water, healthy food to eat, as if they don't matter. And therefore, we don't develop policies that essentially incentivize the protection and stewardship of those things. So I think that one way we can do this is to have a much broader analysis and recognition of wealth in our and the wealth that our policymakers have to manage for. Not just recognizing market wealth in terms of jobs and prosperity and taxes and revenue and all those other indicators that are a reflection of the GDP, but a broader sense of the natural economy, natural capital, which would include the conservation of lands and waters because of all of those things that we get from nature that have value in our lives.
But I don't think that's going to change things or save us fast enough. I think it needs, I'm going to be really, I think it's, maybe David, you'll jump in, but I think it's clear that the climate crisis is an all hands on deck, urgent issue. We have values shifts we can talk about. We have changing concepts. We have changing patterns of behavior. But any political leader worth his or her salt, prepared to look at the science, will say, right, we need to bring in the regulations. We need to do the things that it takes to transition off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. That's our biggest threat to nature right now. Our biggest threat of species extinction is because of the climate crisis. We can't afford to let permafrost melt. We have to keep the Arctic frozen. There are many basics here that are red lines. And then I'd love to see us, I love the Pope, the papal encyclical, Laudate Se, is a fantastic direction to a change in values around what we value and not being a throwaway society and not being founded on greed. It's also the change that we make about being a wasteful, polluting society should lead us in the direction of social justice and equity at the same time. But when you're running out of time, and we are running out of time, politicizing and mobilizing our citizenry and democracies to basically call a foul when you see political leadership that isn't delivering on promises. We have, as David mentioned, a problem south of the border, but goodness only knows how brilliant it's been to see mayors step up and push back on the irresponsibility of Trump to see. But that's in the Canadian context, there's a ton we can do. And to your question earlier, Judy, what do? We still punch above our weight around the world. If we were the first country to go into the climate negotiations that begin again in November and say, our current target is laughably weak, we are pulling it now, and here's our new target, and we challenge other industrialized countries to join us. Because we can't play games anymore, we can't procrastinate, and we can't just say we're doing a good job when we're not. If we were to do that, it would create pressure on the EU to do it too. It would create pressure on China to do more. Canada has a real leadership role if we choose to exercise it.
So I think, Judy, I assume your question is getting at where my colleagues went, which is the economics in the sense that we have created a system as society where pollution is free, including carbon pollution, and destroying the environment is free. There were some regulatory barriers, but essentially it's free. And it's fairly, economics was my major, and it's quite clear that people's behavior will change if it's no longer free. So a price on carbon matters, and I do have to give the Canadian government credit on, even if the targets are too weak. Pushing this country to a national price on carbon is not easy, and Minister McKenna and the Prime Minister deserve some credit on that. We also need to price other kinds of pollution as well. You know, it's not free. And the context for this should be, as a country, we need to remember that if we don't pay attention to these natural issues, it's not just a disaster for nature. And when half of the species populations are in decline, the average decline is 83% amongst those half, that's really serious. But we know it's not just a disaster for nature, it's a disaster for people, and we know that because of the cod fishery collapse in 1992 in Newfoundland. Within a month after that fishery was closed, 40,000 people had lost their jobs. It's the greatest mass layoff in Canadian history because we got out of whack between what was possible with nature and what we were doing. And if you look at the stats, we took this many fish for 400 years, and then for 20, we took that many.
Yeah.
And then it went down to 0. And, you know, academic audience, I assume you know that when John Cabot first came to Newfoundland, his sailors wrote that they could walk from the ship across the backs of the codfish to shore, which was an exaggeration. But there were a hell of a lot of fish. And we destroyed that. And we destroyed people's livelihoods, and we destroyed communities that had been there. I've been to Beta Verde in Newfoundland. Yeah. It's been there for 423 years or something like that. And I'm not exaggerating, I just don't have the exact number. And its complete livelihood was destroyed because we allowed nature to be destroyed. But that's Canada. We know this as Canada. So we should be leading the charge. And pricing matters, regulations matter, but I don't think government can do this alone. I think we need leadership from government, but we have to have industry on side. And we have to have academic institutions and Canadians. And I think Canadians will rally around this kind of cause. You see it already. When governments are tepid, people speak up and say, do it. And if we as a country can't remember what happens when you ignore the environment and do something about it, what's going to happen with those countries that haven't seen those recent kinds of natural disasters that don't just affect nature, affect people? You know, if we can't show the leadership, who's going to?
But how do you get industry on side when they're, you know, profit-based?
Because it's not in their interest to destroy the resource that makes their industry work. It's an enlightened self-interest. Now, there's some problems. The current way the financing capitalist system works, it tends to focus on real short-term, quarterly goals. But if you look at more the enlightened self-interest of business as represented by businesses that are owned privately that can think about the future, they behave very differently. Loblaw, Galen Weston's an environmental leader. He worked with the World Wildlife Fund. He set a goal that all of the fish they sell in Loblaw was going to be sustainable by 2013, certified sustainable by outside certifiers. And he did that because he's an environmentalist, but he also did it because he knows that his children and grandchildren are going to be in the business of selling food in Canada, and he wants them to have products to sell. Every business should be able to see things that way. And by the way, he didn't reach his goal. He got to 88%. Couldn't get to 100 because of shrimp, essentially, because shrimp internationally, it's horrendous the way it's
He shouldn't sell
harvested.
anything that comes from mangrove massacre shrimp.
May-
I hope none of you never buy shrimp in the shrimp rings from any industrialized store because it involves human slavery, believe it or not, destruction of the biodiversity of the mangroves, creation of shrimp ponds that destroy the protection that mangroves used to offer interior communities, allows salinization of agricultural areas, impoverishing communities, and and of course they don't last very long when they move to the next poison shrimp farm. So if you see a lovely cheap shrimp ring from Thailand, don't buy it. So sorry to interrupt about Galen, but
Elizabeth, when you get on a roll, it's just a delight to listen.
mangrove massacre shrimp is off the menu. But I wanted to say something about industry, Judy, because people make an assumption that political leaders may be ready to move, but they can't because of industry pressure. There's one little vignette from Stephen Harper's years that is a true story. I don't know if it's ever been in the media, but a group of CEOs from the oil sands came to Ottawa to meet with Harper. You know this story, David? They came to Langevin Block, to the Prime Minister's office. They out ahead that they all wanted to meet with him. He knew what they wanted, so he left them in the antechamber all day long. They never even sent a staffer out to meet with CEOs of major oil companies who'd come to Ottawa to tell Stephen Harper they wanted a carbon tax. They went back to Calgary disappointed. So it's
And then signed an agreement with the Premier of Alberta.
Yeah.
It is possible. You know, it's not, it's not, there are some examples like Exxon, which has behaved criminally.
Yeah.
But Shell, you know, if you listen to the president of Shell, he sounds like Elizabeth May. Not quite. Okay?
when you
First of all,
get him on shrimp.
He's a man. Yeah, he doesn't buy shrimp.
Doesn't like-
But you know, he says we have to grapple with carbon, and one way we can cope with it as an industry is having a price. I mean, he's really clear. So it is eminently possible. And what's the choice?
Yeah.
But what are we going to do otherwise if we don't work on it?
You know, a number of years ago, I went to a place, Anchorage, Alaska, I believe it was, and we were talking with different Indigenous communities from different countries. And one of the things we wanted to do was come up with a statement on the use of fossil fuels, or eliminate the use of fossil fuels. And so we're kind of going back and forth between the different regions, like the Arctic and the different areas. And we couldn't come up with a one statement coming from Indigenous groups. And the reason why was that because communities have lived too long in poverty, and they've been fighting for how many years to be a part of the oil and gas industry. And they said, no, we cannot agree to this because they finally allowed us to be part of the oil and gas industry. And I think that's the problem that we're going to face with the Indigenous communities, because people are living in poverty. And that's one of the reasons why KI said, no, you're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to stand by and watch you extract all the resources from our area and not get anything back for the community. And so I think that's some of the things that we also have to consider, is that when you live in a community, you watch people struggling to survive on a day-to-day basis. And this is Canada, and Faisal mentioned that this is rich in resources. So why are people living in poverty, especially the original inhabitants of this land? So we have to kind of look at that and get our head wrapped around, how did this happen? Did this happen by choice?
Yes.
Yeah, well, see, the thing is, it happened by choice from the outside, not from the Indigenous people themselves. Because I like to see good things happening in the community, proper infrastructure, you know, things like that. Yeah. So those are some of the things we have to start thinking about in terms of resource development and other things that we want to try and make things better. But keep in mind that there'll be some resistance from certain communities who have finally fought for that right to be involved in that industry. I just want to kind of throw that in, muddy the water a little bit more.
If I can just add on it, you know, I work with a fellow by the name of Miles Richardson, who's Haida, and you know, Miles would oftentimes come into the David Suzuki Foundation office, and he wants to, you know, he'd say, I want to remind you, poverty sucks. You know, it really, really stinks. And at the same time, the Haida have put well over 50% of their traditional territories into protection under their own Indigenous laws, as Elizabeth talked about, in terms of places like Waihanas. The same thing with the Gitgat, the same thing with the Haltsik, the same thing with the Kitasoo-Hehe, and on and on and on and on. And that's absolutely remarkable for me, because I have yet to find any element of society that's willing to say, you know what, we're going to give most of what we have back to the caribou and the polar bears, the grizzly bears and such. And you know, you asked if there's any hope, and I would say there is actually a really interesting opportunity, which Professor Robin Roth and others are working on, which is that the federal Canadian government has now recognized the amazing potential Indigenous peoples coming forward with conservation vision for this country, and it created an expedited policy pathway for Indigenous communities to come forward with tribal protected areas or other areas that are conserved under Indigenous forms of governance. And these will be recognized by Canada in terms of how we report out to the international community under the Convention on the Biological Diversity. We were the first country to ratify the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992 at the Rio Summit. And my phone is literally ringing off the hook as First Nations and Inuit and Métis nations are coming on and saying, how do we take a section, if not all of our traditional territories, and put it into conservation, but not as a protected area under colonial laws, under Federal Parks Act or the Provincial Parks Act, but under our own ancestral Indigenous laws, which, as John so eloquently mentioned, that's a huge shift on the part of the Canadian government, a recalibration of policy, of parks policy, to recognizing the leadership of Indigenous peoples in terms of stewarding their lands. And I think Canadians need to get behind this, because if we don't, it won't succeed, and that will be a real shame.
Can I go back to the economics part of the question for a second? I've always thought that's an unbelievable false dichotomy, because it assumes that environmental damage is free, and we know it isn't from the cod example and others. And it's also false on another level. If you look at the efforts just on climate change at the moment that have been made to combat climate change seriously, you can't find examples where you've been successful in combating climate change and it's been bad for the economy.
Right.
It's actually the opposite. And it's hard for people to get their head around, because if you're putting a price on oil and gas, it may affect the oil and gas industry. But Canada as a whole, and the economy as a whole, it's the other way around. BC is the first example. They put the first price on carbon. Their economic growth exceeds everywhere else in Canada. Now, personally, I think economic growth is a bad thing to measure, but that's what we measure at the moment. And theirs exceeded everywhere else in Canada after the price on carbon. So,
And the jobs numbers went up.
and the jobs numbers went up. So more people working. Toronto, City of Toronto, brought in place a plan in 2007 to address climate change. It's called Changes in the Air. It had a whole range of energy retrofits on buildings, all sorts of things, transportation, cycling, walking, tons of measures, and the provincial government closed the Lakeview coal-fired plant. By 2012, the greenhouse gas emissions from the Toronto geographic area, not the operations of the city, the whole geographic area had gone down 15%. Okay, look at Toronto in 2012 and 2007 and look at all those cranes and look at the job numbers and look at everything else. Yes, Toronto's got some challenges of equity and inclusion, but jobs were up, the economy was up, and greenhouse gases have gone down 15%. It's an absolutely false dichotomy. It just simply is, and there's lots of economic reasons for it, because what you need to do to build a society that is less greenhouse gas reliant actually creates all sorts of jobs and employment. And that narrative, we just need to get beyond. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to do the things we need to as rapidly as Elizabeth points out that we need to.
So how do you get that message out there? I mean,
You say it loudly at the University of Guelph, and then they all go tell other people. And you rely on politicians like Elizabeth May, who has the ear of Canada. And find journalists from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, brackets, retired brackets.
I'm going to offer a slightly different opinion. So I think regulations are very important. I feel very, very strongly around the need for policy, ambitious, brave policy, and I think we do actually have policymakers that are willing to do that. I am incredibly concerned about the fact that many Canadians are effectively disconnected from the natural world. And I think it's in our interests to get Canadians out into nature. We need Canadians to get out into nature because they're going to fall in love with nature. And if they're going to fall in love with nature, they're going to be much more willing to fight for nature, to actually advocate for the policies that people like David and Elizabeth are fighting for. There is absolutely no way that anyone is going to fight to protect caribou under the Species at Risk Act if they don't feel that they have some relationship to the wild. And it doesn't necessarily have to be wilderness. It can be, green space in an urban area. And so there are a number of amazing initiatives all across the country, in many ways led by the WWF, around getting people out into nature, particularly children. And that's really, really critical if we are going to essentially create the next generation of environmental leaders, because at some point we're not going to be here. We need people, the young people that are in this room, to take this on and to carry this fight on. And having that relationship with nature is so critical in terms of the rationale to fight hard. So that's what I feel very, very strongly. Outside of all of the regulatory discussions that need to happen as well.
I must echo that getting people on the land, especially young people in our area, we're trying to get them out to go out on the land and to learn about the land, and it's exactly what Faisal was talking about. If you grow to fall in love with the land or fall in love with something, you're willing to protect it even more. And I think that's one of the philosophies that we also have, is to try and get people out on the land, especially in Chimeksabeninwak.
It's like hearing a story of somebody in a war zone. If you hear their story, you know what you're caring about. If you go out into the land, you know what you're caring about. But it's a concept otherwise. And not many people buy into concepts.
I'd go a step further. I think there's a great thirst amongst Canadians to actually do something. And it's one of the things we're trying to mobilize in response to the Living Planet Canada report is help citizens find an easy way to contribute.
I'd like to help citizens find a hard way to contribute. Because, I'm just playing.
You're so great.
But the reason is, there's some other dysfunctional things about our society. And for some reason, I'm going back to the papal encyclical, probably because I was talking about it at a churchy conference recently. But when Pope Francis says that we're living in a constant state of schizophrenia, that resonated for me. There's something about our society that's both alienating and numbing and anxiety provoking, and leads people to wonder about if they ponder big questions, which other generations used to ponder more often, like the meaning of life. If your life has meaning, you've got way better mental health, you've got more sense of purpose, gives you a sense of optimism and a sense of well-being. It's actually essential for our health as individual people in this current society to take on something that makes your life matter a lot. Mm-hmm. And so you can save the world 2 minutes a day by turning off the tap when you brush your teeth, yeah. But you save the world a whole lot more if you decide you're going to lock arms with First Nations on a protest line and face civil disobedience and arrest. It's a hard thing to do. That's way outside your comfort zone. But all of you as young people, the challenges are real, but they're also the chance, and I couldn't agree more with David, that Canadians want to feel part of something that's extraordinary and meaningful. And the Québécois would say, a projet de société. An all hands on deck moment. And we haven't had anything like that in this country or this continent since the Second World War. And my mom grew up with that. She grew up with victory gardens and all the good stuff of everybody together with one purpose. One last thought, Judy. My dad used to say, and he was a kid in London during the Blitz, and he used to say, you know, I think I preferred the Second World War. And I said, what? Why would you ever say that? He said, well, you know, we always had the feeling the government was on our side. Something that pulls us together would be darn good.
Well, let's follow up, Elizabeth, with everyone else, because we're going to go to questions from the audience in a minute. But I think it's useful to go from here with an idea or a thought about what each of us could actually go after. I'm not sure about the arm-in-arm thing in Stratford, where I live.
You don't necessarily have a reason to.
But, you know, what could each of you suggest as one thing each of us could do?
Well, we're going to add civil disobedience to the World Wildlife Fund Canada's official list of citizen engagement opportunities. And I shouldn't make light of it. It really does, at the right time, it does matter to stand up. I think the generation that's in this room is already doing it and living it. And they're actually forcing the people that are in positions of authority to change their behavior and change their institutions. So we here, WWF works with whoever is necessary to solve a problem. So we have lots of relationships with businesses because they're necessary to solve a problem. Every single one of our business partners tells us they're trying to truly live environmental values in their business because they can't hire young people unless they do. So, you know, people who are students right now have amazing power. If you go to an employer and say, what's your sustainability strategy? All you have to do is ask the question. You know, hopefully they give you a satisfactory answer and you keep staying and you you do your interview and get a job. But you ask that question, they hear, oh my God, I can't get good people unless I'm sustainable. And every single business we work with is telling us that. Which wasn't the answer to my question. I've talked a lot, but can I add one more bit? Because that's the first part. The second is we have 2 programs that we're building. We just did an analysis of the health of the fresh water all across Canada. And the biggest result is a lack of data in huge swaths. And people can actually get engaged as citizen scientists, and we're building 2 programs, one with the assistance of the World Bank, one with Environment Canada, to help develop this data in places where it doesn't exist, particularly about the benthic invertebrates. Did I get that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Bugs, from a communications person, in the bottom in the mud, and they're a real indicator of the health of rivers, and there's not consistent data across the country. People can do that. And because of our partnership with Environment Canada, that's now going to get recorded in national databases. So there'll be actual national databases of citizen science. And we're not doing the work. It's hundreds of conservation organizations that we're partnered with across the country. Those are the kinds of things I was talking about when I meant easy.
Yeah.
I didn't mean it was easy work. Make it simple for people to do those things. And I think those are fulfilling and rewarding and meaningful.
Thank you. John?
You know, one time I was in British Columbia, and this lady from a different country came in, and she asked me, she says, why are you guys so disobedient? You block roads, you do all these things. and I said, well, we tend to look at it as being obedient to who we are. Mm-hmm. Being obedient to protect the territory, protect ourselves. And when we do the things we need to do, we're being obedient to the instructions that we have to protect the territory and to maintain our lives also. So it depends on the way you look at it. And I think in a lot of areas with the English language, you would have to challenge and be critical when somebody says, there was a massacre where the Indians massacred a whole ton of soldiers over there. And then on this side, there was a victory because the soldiers won. So I think we have to kind of look at the type of language that we use and begin to critically say, okay, what is the real story here? Because that's the only way we'll head towards justice and economic justice on top of that. That's my thinking on it.
Basil?
Well, I'll look at my own life. I was trained as a scientist, and I worked in labs, and I worked in the field in the North and the Maritimes. And I don't think I actually became a particularly effective environmentalist until I started working with Indigenous peoples and spending time in their communities with elders, with youth, hunters and trappers. I think it behooves all Canadians to go beyond sort of our intent around reconciliation to actually develop meaningful relationships with the Indigenous peoples that are in our communities. Earlier today, we had an amazing reception at the art gallery here, and there are some remarkable pieces of art that are there that are very much inspired by stories of the land. Christy Belcourt, for example, Norval Morisseau. And I think that's really important because, we do have to recognize we are all treaty peoples as well. It would be absolutely unacceptable if we left it up to the community in KI or the Doig people or the Gitga'at people to have to fight on their own, alone. That's just not acceptable. And so I would say that is really my message in terms of how to be a more effective environmentalist that's aligned with a real strong commitment to justice. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I think there are some questions now from the audience.
There are more. So we will see how many we get through. You can start with that, and then we'll go to the person if you just name her. Or the...
Okay. Abigail wrote a question.
We'll bring a microphone to so that you can ask the question.
Oh, hang on, Abigail. Microphone's coming.
Yeah, we'll get this down.
Do you want to? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you can ask your own question. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
If you remember what it is.
Yeah, I had 2 different questions. Am I allowed to ask both of them? Okay. So my first question was directed to Elizabeth May, talking about transboundary environmental issues. How are you going to, or how is your views and your party views going to deal with those, specifically in terms of the Great Lakes and atmospheric quality?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Abigail. We're fortunate that Donald Trump hasn't made any statements in the Rose Garden about the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. And actually, just while I'm at it, his statement about the Paris Accord had no legal effect. We have a shared responsibility that is enshrined in legislation to protect the Great Lakes. Canada wasn't pulling our weight at all for the previous 10 years. The funding for Great Lakes work dramatically declined. But your question was broader. There's a lot of good, solid international law around the good neighbor principle. It actually started also in the early part of the 1900s with the Trail smelter case, where on the Canadian side of the border, a smelter was contaminating life for people on the US side of the border. So we have a pretty good regime around direct neighbor-to-neighbor relations, around protection of shared water bodies, airsheds. The difficulty is, at the moment, that we don't have such a willing partner at the federal level in the US. Around the Great Lakes, though, there are so many, it's a huge number of, millions of Canadians, obviously, but also millions of people in the States. Many congressional seats depend on taking good care of the Great Lakes. And I don't think that Trump's proposed budget to not spend anything on the Great Lakes will get anywhere in the US Congress. So, and just in general, since you asked me on behalf of my party how we deal with things, by the way, I have no relationship with Theresa May, but I am worried about a coughing fit. So I brought Fishermen's Friends with me, and they're interfering. And the Green Party globally, there's Greens all around the world, so on many issues, particularly trade deals, I work a lot with the European Union Greens. I work a lot with the New Zealand and Australia Greens. So it's that way. We have a lot of international and global perspective because of working together through a lot of global issues.
Thank you.
You had a
I did.
question
I
for
had
David?
a second question. I originally wanted to direct it to David, but anyone can answer it as well. It was about the Species at Risk Act and whether you thought it was effective, or if you wanted to comment on its effectiveness, and on the flip side of that, if you thought it was doing any sort of harm in relation to its intended purpose.
It's not effective, sadly. Although I suppose a fair scientist would say we really don't know yet, because it's taken so long to develop plans for identified species. Like the endangered St. Lawrence beluga, we knew was likely to be endangered before the act came in, and it took, I think, 11 years before it got identified, and then another year or two to name its calving grounds or something as a protected area. That was all known before the act even came in. So the delays, and it's due to all sorts of reasons, pressure from lobbying and things, have been horrendous. Could the act work if it didn't have those delays? Well, nobody knows. So in some ways, it is a problem because it's there, and so people think of species are being protected, and they're really not. That's the short version of it. Okay, maybe some examples, but basically it's no, it hasn't succeeded, I think is the fair and balanced comment.
But I think we have to be clear. It hasn't succeeded because it hasn't been implemented. And where we have endangered species legislation, like for example in Ontario, provincially, this provincial government has actually exempted the very industries that are driving species to extinction. So, this act would work. There is lots of evidence.
I'm not sure you can say that, Faisal.
Well, you look at the Endangered Species Act in the United States and how successful it's been to protect and recover populations like the Yellowstone grizzly bear population, which was, circling the drain and now is a much more robust place because of the fact that there was political leadership. Mind you, the federal government and state governments were held accountable by NGOs that were suing those governments.
But it was more than
Yeah.
that. The Endangered Species Act in the US is effective because it says you can't destroy endangered species or their habitat. The Species at Risk Act in Canada only affects species if they're in federal areas. It's extremely restrictive, and there's a whole template of ways that the federal government and the minister can get out of listing a species even when recommended by CSIWIC, which was a loophole put in under Chrétien. So you would have thought Jean Chrétien would bring in a better Species at Risk Act than Richard Nixon. But Nixon's is the winner.
I'm more on Elizabeth's. I think our act there's too many loopholes, and it needs to be significantly strengthened if it's ever going to succeed.
I just think, I've spent a lot of time, I worked for years trying to get an Endangered Species Act in British Columbia. I worked on the Endangered Species Act in Ontario, and I just think that we have to be really, really careful if we want to open up the Species at Risk Act right now. I think what I would do is I would try to hold governments accountable, and the Suzuki Foundation and others are doing it, because we're actually suing the federal government to actually implement the very legislation that they are obligated to implement in terms of coming out with recovery plans and listing species and such. But I worry a little bit about an attitude developing where we might say that an Endangered Species Act in principle isn't an effective tool. I think that the evidence in the United States, for example, is that it can work, but only if there is political will to actually execute the act itself.
I agree with you completely. It's just this Endangered Species Act isn't working. That's our perspective.
And the other piece is resourcing, because over the last 10 years, there were 2 people in Environment Canada in charge of recovery plans. Last I checked, there were 2 people inside Environment Canada in charge of recovery plans. So that has something to do with why it takes so long.
Aren't they on sabbatical?
The next question from Eva Amantorp. Eva, do you want the?
She's at the front.
She's at the front here. Yeah.
My question was
I think you need the mic because it might be being taped.
My question is to John Cutfeed and Elizabeth May. Welcome to chime in as well. How do you see the federal and provincial implementation of UNDRIP affecting environmental policy development by those governments, by the federal and provincial government?
I think, for me, I think first of all we need to understand that a lot of the pieces of legislation that impact Indigenous people was done without input from Indigenous people. And I think if you're going to implement UNDRIP, you're going to have to get a clear understanding of exactly what do certain clauses of UNDRIP mean in order to protect the environment. Because our people have always been careful to protect the environment, but if government is willing to just go ahead and implement UNDRIP without actually being clear on what that means, I think we'll run into a problem. But at the same time, we have to begin to look at what potential other pieces of legislation may impact and nullify UNDRIP as it moves forward. I think those are the things that need to happen within Canadian society, is that there are a lot of pieces of legislation that negatively impact Indigenous people. So you kind of have to do a legislative review overall, because a lot of those pieces of legislation have basically dispossessed Indigenous people of their duties to protect the territory, protect the environment. So it's going to be a lot of work, and I think if the political will is there, I'm sure that the implementation of UNDRIP will be a good move, if, depending on how far the government is willing to go. Even though they say they're willing to implement UNDRIP, we kind of hear different things along the same time on the impossibility of even putting UNDRIP into domestic law.
Yeah, the government of British Columbia, and you probably know that because of 3 Green MLAs being elected in British Columbia, they negotiated to figure out what to do with a minority legislature with 40% of the people of BC having voted Liberal. The BC Liberals are basically Conservatives. And 40% of the BC voters voting NDP and 17% voting Green. And the negotiations were important, but just to say that they came up with a confidence and supply agreement where there were bottom line principles that as long as the governing party, being the NDP, kept to these basic principles and strong commitments, the 3 Green MLAs wouldn't be part of their government, but would keep them from collapsing on a confidence vote, forcing BCers back to the polls. The top commitment is that British Columbia will implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which as far as I know makes BC the first operating governmental process of what do we do about, as John said, there are conflicting laws. There are a lot of conflicting laws. And if you look federally, and one does need to, if you look at the Indian Act, we have still on our books an act so appalling that it makes you ill to have such a racist and discriminatory piece of legislation governing Indigenous peoples who are considered part of the Indian Act. It doesn't apply to Métis and Inuit communities, but you can't begin to imagine how the Indian Act can stand with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there's a huge amount of work. And the consultations, you can't once again have a bunch of parliamentarians who are non-Indigenous write legislation about the land rights and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples on this continent.
Can I add one point to that, if you don't mind? I think also Canadians need to recognize that we have an obligation to implement UNDRIP as Canadians. And we need to listen to what Chief Justice Sinclair said when he urged all Canadians to act upon the recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of which is to implement the UNDRIP. And so because the topic of tonight is conservation, one of the actual articles of the UNDRIP says that conservation of Indigenous lands cannot happen without the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. The fact is, most of the protected areas that were created in Canada were not created with the consent, let alone even the effective consultation with Indigenous peoples. So as we as environmentalists need to make sure that we do conservation very, very differently. We need to decolonize our own structures in terms of our aspirations around protecting the planet. And one of the things that I did is I'm leaving the Suzuki Foundation to join the University of Guelph in about a month. One of the last things I did was successfully pass a policy at the board of the David Suzuki Foundation, which now commits our organization to actually implementing our work as an environmental group in line with the UNDRIP. We have to. And it's had a remarkable, fundamental change in terms of how the David Suzuki Foundation now operates on Indigenous territories, very, very differently than when I first started at the organization. And I think that's something that the University of Guelph should consider. The University of Guelph should be implementing the UNDRIP in terms of how our activities may impact Indigenous peoples.
And that leads nicely to the next question. Justine?
Thank you so much to all the panelists. This question is mostly directed to John, but maybe Faisal, you might want to chime in too based on your David Suzuki experience. What kind of guidance or advice would you give to environmental groups who are seeking to collaborate with Indigenous-led conservation initiatives or who want to support in an allied way that kind of conservation? What kind of advice would you give to those environmental groups? And then a second part of the question has to do with a statement that I've heard, and I've heard it many times before, and I've even used it myself, that sometimes it feels like kind of the last great stand to make a change with the environment is going to be First Nations rights because they have a lot of power. And I just wonder if, I also feel uncomfortable about that statement, and is it troubling as a First Nations person to hear that it's like your responsibility somehow, or it falls to you because you have those rights, and how might settler society support that kind of a struggle?
So shall we start with the advice for environmental groups?
Okay, I think the advice that I would have is when, and I think Faisal mentioned that you would require the consent of the people to work with them, the free, prior, informed consent. That's very important, that's critical. But also at the same time, whatever statement you make to support Indigenous groups, you stand by that, because sometimes what happens in society is that government comes and wants to make a deal in order to split up groups, like for example the environmentalists, also and the Indigenous people. And so you're going to have to decide on exactly how far you're willing to support Indigenous groups. There was an incident that happened where our people felt like we were thrown under the bus in favor of a piece of legislation which an environmental group supported, when they had said that they were not going to move on that piece of legislation without Indigenous people. But once the legislation moved forward, they supported the legislation in opposition provided by Indigenous people. So be clear on what it is. You have your own agendas, but at the same time, if you're going to be supporting Indigenous people, stay committed.
And the second part of that?
No, I kind of missed the second part of, you made a quote of some quote.
It was said earlier in the panel that that First Nations rights would be one way that certain developments might get stopped. Like I've heard that used with the Northern Gateway project, for example, in BC, a big pipeline project. That it's, I just wonder, is that a way that environmentalists might fall into a trap of kind of instrumentalizing First Nations political rights or struggles for an environmental cause, or is that a potential place where environmentalists and First Nations can work together to support First Nations rights?
I think there's an opportunity to work together with various groups who wish to support Indigenous rights, but you have to keep in mind that we cannot be only the ones at the front lines. There was a discussion there last week too, and that's the same thing that I heard, was that, well, how can we support Indigenous people deal with some of the pipelines that are coming through? And my thinking was, well, what can you do as an individual? What gift do you bring? We all have gifts as people. So what gift do you bring that can help support the struggle in order to try and make sure that environment is not threatened, people are not threatened? So what can you do? We can't always be the ones at the forefront. I mean, it's good we speak out for our rights, and it's good that we have the support of larger society, but we have to really think about what is my commitment to the protection of the environment, and what is my commitment to Indigenous people, and what gifts do I bring to enable that support. I hope that answers your question.
We have a question here from the Conservation Leadership Program, high school students. Shall I read it? And it's directed to all of you. What can the next generation do to have the most impact on linking conservation and environmental management with stronger nation-to-nation relations?
You know, one of the things that I talked about is that we have to, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau talked about establishing that nation-to-nation relationship. But I think one of the things that you can do is encourage the Prime Minister and government to address the fact that the legislative basis on which land is being governed under this country needs to change. I talk about that 0.2%. I keep going back to that because that is vested in the Crown. It's not vested in the people. The 0.2% reserve land base right across the country is vested under the federal Crown. And also the other 99.8% is vested in the province and other federal interrelations. But the thing is, there's nothing for Indigenous people under that regime. So I would encourage that you push for that to change, because it's not going to be a true nation-to-nation basis when you have one party without any land and resources, as my uncle was told when I mentioned earlier.
One specific thing young people can do is, and I think Justin Trudeau actually intended, certainly during the election, and still is struggling with the challenges of what's in every single mandate letter to his ministers, that there is no relationship more important to this government then our relationship with Indigenous peoples and wanting to move to respectful nation-to-nation relationship. And then in conflict with that, a number of things that were egregious, like the Site C permits, Kinder Morgan permits, things that I didn't think they would do. But Justin Trudeau has also made himself minister responsible for youth. He's Prime Minister and Minister for Youth. So I think the voices of people who are perhaps too young to vote, you have a minister at the cabinet table. He's the Minister for Youth, and he could have a word with the Prime Minister.
I guess I go back a bit to the point I made earlier. I don't know, who asked, can the people put their hands up who asked the question? Okay, so there's 14 of you, 15? So you collectively have a really powerful voice. And if respecting and reconciling with our First Nations is part of your beliefs, and respecting our environment is part of your beliefs, I would urge you to live that and express that all the time. In school, when you're looking for work, speaking to people, it is amazing how powerful it is when people speak up and behave consistently with those values. It's an incredibly powerful thing, and it actually changes society. The politicians we elect are a reflection of that. We've got great leaders like Elizabeth, but they're a reflection of those values. And if those are your values, articulate them and live them, and you'll discover that there's 15 of you here, all of a sudden there's 1,500 and 15,000. It's very, very powerful. And it goes back to the point I made earlier about employers. We're hearing this because people like you are saying to their employers, these are the kind of companies we want to work with. So ask them, what's their sustainability plan? What's their reconciliation plan? How are they adhering to UNDRIP? UNDRIP. I hate acronyms. Ask them that. It's incredibly powerful, and it's a really powerful way to make change to society, the kind of change that you believe in.
Elizabeth can correct me if I'm wrong. I think Romeo Saganash said in the House that there can't be reconciliation without justice. Mm-hmm. And I fear that the type of reconciliation that's being bandied around right now does not go, it's about a mile wide, inch deep. I think it's very important that we do land acknowledgements, but reconciliation is not going to just stop there, right? And Chief Justice Sinclair has described an incredible roadmap in the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 95 calls to action, around Canadians not just recognizing historical injustices against Indigenous peoples, but working with Indigenous peoples to make sure that they do not continue. And that includes the assaults on the land that are happening right now. I would also add that one of the things that I'm discovering as an academic and working with Dr. Robin Roth and others is that there's a lot of really good data that Indigenous-led conservation is actually more effective at protecting and restoring biodiversity. There's some really good research in Amazonia, for example, with the Kayapo. And this is one of the things that I'll be doing at the University of Guelph when I join in about a month's time, is looking at what is the conservation effectiveness of Indigenous-led forms of governance. And I think we're going to be, I think our hypothesis is going to be proven, which is that when you invest in local communities to be able to regain the governance that they've had for thousands and thousands of years, the knowledge that they've had on how that ecosystem works, the recognitions of how to interact with that ecosystem in a way without degrading it, we're actually going to find that Indigenous-led forms of governance on the land are probably more effective than the piecemeal national and provincial parks, the ineffectual Species at Risk Act, and the other regulations that we need to be much more effective. So just imagine a vision, a true nation-to-nation vision, where we have colonial structures, colonial laws that are acting upon the landscape, the Species at Risk Act, the National Parks Act, and then we have Indigenous laws as well that act as a safety net to help pick up all of those elements of the natural world that fall through the cracks when the SARA doesn't get implemented and you've got something like beluga whales that don't get listed or grizzly bears or such. I think that's going to be a really interesting vision for the country. A true nation-to-nation vision, knitting together those different types of governance.
Well, thank you all. That brings this part of the evening to an end, and thank you to John Cutfeed, Elizabeth May, David Miller, Dr. Faisal Mullah. We are going to be around for another half an hour. I'm sorry. We have some closing comments. And we have some closing comments.
I'm always standing between you and some refreshments. Thank you very, very much. It's my pleasure to, by the way, I'm John Smithers, Chair of the Geography Department. It's my real pleasure to, first of all, thank our panelists for really a fantastic evening. The time flew. I'd be happy to give you my next 5 minutes if you'd like to have another question or two, but because I know that's what people came to hear. But thank you very much for everybody involved tonight, and especially our panelists and the really enthusiastic and thoughtful reflections that they offered that I know have been really exciting and possibly influential. In fact, I'm sure they're influential on some of the young scholars that we have here tonight and people who are in our programs, imagining being in our programs. For the group that's joined us from local high schools, welcome very much to tonight's event. Really, you're the people, as was mentioned earlier, who are going to undertake some of the important work that needs doing and make the changes that need to happen, and it's fantastic to have you here tonight. As you heard tonight, there's a lot of creative complexity in Canada around conservation, and I'm glad that we had a number of issues come up tonight that were complicated, that didn't lend themselves to simplistic solutions, that there was no easy trite response. These issues are difficult. They're fraught with all sorts of history, all sorts of baggage, all sorts of complexity, and it's good to talk about those things. We use a horrible word in academia sometimes that refer to things being problematized. You want to problematize something, and really that just means let's talk about the fact that this is sticky. It's got a lot of layers to it. It's an onion. We need to peel away at many issues before we can get to the heart of the matter. And these types of conversations tonight, I think, did a wonderful job of doing some of that. So thank you very much. Guelph's a place where we welcome this sort of engagement on the natural, both in the natural and the social sciences, for active engagement on issues around the environment. And universities are privileged places for this type of thing in that they're places for knowledge mobilization outward, but they're also places for knowledge creation and synthesis where we have the ability to integrate ideas, debate ideas across ideas boundaries and debate with each other in a way that many people in professional life and in their practice simply don't have the time or the scope to do. So we're a lucky lot here. And it's partly for that reason that we have begun a consultative process both on campus and off campus in the last few months, and we'll move more energetically into it soon, to help us vision as a department of geography, but also as a wider campus, how we could think about development of a professional graduate program in conservation leadership and governance, and how that could be of value to practicing conservation professionals who are seeking to continue their education in ways that help them deal with some of the complexities that they're dealing with in their everyday jobs or in the advocacy that they hope to complete. Such programs exist in a few jurisdictions outside Canada. We're not aware that anything like this exists within Canada. There are a couple in the United States and a very well-developed and inspiring program at Cambridge University in the UK. This suggests to us the possibility of Guelph, because of its long legacy and its natural feel. I think President Vaccarino at the very beginning said that Guelph's, in some ways, the natural DNA of the place is for this type of scholarship and this type of advocacy. We think that this is a natural place for this type of program and that the time is right for it. So there's a little bit of consultation process. This is not by any means any sort of an announcement. It's the beginning of an announcement. There's an intention or an interest in the department to begin a conversation around campus with partners both in the community and around the campus to see if we might move in that direction. So I guess in the business world they say watch this space. So watch this space. In keeping with that aspiration, we're really delighted that Dr. Faisal Mullah, who's been a panelist here today, will be joining us as an associate professor. this coming December. I've had the luxury of seeing Faisal's workload form. He has not yet seen his workload form in the winter semester, but he's going to be one busy fella. When he gets that course run down on social geography in the city, we'll.
Oh my God.
Now, Faisal's going to be joining a group of scholars in the department that are rapidly moving to the forefront of conservation, social science, contemporary conservation, social science, and will help us achieve what we think is already well on the way to becoming a critical mass of scholarship in this area, that we've got an area of potential excellence here. Well, not potential, we do have an area of excellence in this field, and I think the time is right for us to capitalize on that. So take that as a statement of intent. He also joins a campus with an eclectic and full spectrum of scholars that are interested and active on the conservation file right across the board, the full spectrum. The natural science-driven understanding of ecological processes and systems, the role of markets and economic and conservation initiatives and outcomes. We heard a little bit about that tonight. Indigenous knowledge systems and the importance of the truth and reconciliation, how that needs to inform and change all that we do at the university, both teaching and research and outreach. Things like the emerging mechanisms for conservation practice. You know, one of the things, the most interesting things is how new stakeholders, new voices, new sensibilities are entering the realm of environmental governance, and that environmental governance isn't simply the work of state-down actors, as we might have been taught in a 1970s resource management course in geography, but there's a multiplicity of actors involved in environmental management and conservation practice today, and that really informs current best practice. So lots of things to think about there. And of course, the politics of protected area establishment. Some of our existing faculty are interested and active in that field in both land and water in the marine context as well. So a wonderful opportunity appears to be at hand for not just geography, but for Guelph's wider conservation community to integrate science, policy, society, and practice in a way that can advance both scholarship knowledge and the ability to be better conservationists. So clearly, very clearly, tonight's conversation is a conversation starter, not a conversation that's concluded. So once again, I'd like to thank Kinross Gold Corporation for their support of the Kinross Chair in Environmental Governance Program, which has been the catalyst for this exercise. I don't want to keep going, but it came across that I think this ties together quite nicely and quickly the importance of the Kinross gift in the first place. Let me read to you a piece about the Kinross. This is a short extract from the Kinross Gold gift to the university in the first place. Environmental governance is about how society sees the environment and how key actors take decisions that affect the environment and discharge accountabilities at all levels of society, international, regional, national, subnational, local, and community, in the interest of the environment and the context of other social objectives, social, cultural, and economic. That blend of many considerations at many different scales of analysis, the principle on which the gift was given and the chair was created, was to create forums just like this, where we can call attention to the complexities of environmental management and the new voices rightfully present that are part of that emerging conversation around conservation. So this is exactly what the chair has been established to do, and I'm going to get it checked off as a highly successful event. So thank you very much to our Kinross representatives tonight. And with that, I think I'm to tell you that there are some nibbles that are about to arrive shortly and some refreshments, so please do stay, continue your conversations, and help yourself. Thank you everyone for participating tonight.
This was a delight.